Good evening. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Harold Holzer. I have the privilege of serving as director of the Roosevelt House, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all for a program focused on what we can probably say with some assurance was not one of Franklin Roosevelt's favorite branches of government, the Supreme Court, but he never knew Sandra Day O'Connor, so that's what separates it. It is a special opportunity to focus on an institution that today arouses as much passionate interest and outrage, crossed fingers, and suggestions for reform and upheaval as when the occupant of this house attempted to pack it. And wouldn't you know that for the first time since the New Deal got buffeted by challenges in 1937, in yet another example of history inevitably repeating itself, people are actually talking about expanding the court again. I wish I could say that FDR and Eleanor turned a lot of their attention to the court while they occupied this building for the 25 years leading up to, that included FDR's recovery from polio, his comeback in politics, his service as governor, his election as president, and his work here as president-elect from November 1932 to March 1933, when he left for Washington, his inauguration and his destiny. But I'm not sure, the one connection, that if FDR had not welcomed his state labor commissioner, Frances Perkins, to this house, had he not asked her here to become the first woman to serve in a presidential cabinet, had she not accepted, maybe we would not have reached the point at the precise moment that we did when a woman could and would be nominated and confirmed to serve on the United States Supreme Court. The fact is that that offer and that move to advance the status of women in American public life took place here in the home of the future First Lady of the world and the patron saint of global human rights, does suggest, I know I'm stretching, but it suggests an unbroken chain of aspiration for gender equality and equal opportunity that does stretch back to the Roosevelt's occupancy here. I was telling our special guest tonight that I had two opportunities to interact personally with Justice O'Connor. First, hosting her and her husband at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where they seemed as interested in my Abraham Lincoln display pieces as in their tour of the Met. And second, we had an opportunity to talk about Abraham Lincoln when she was preparing to write on the subject. They're very nice memories. She was very, very gracious, and they make it even more poignant for me that we're hosting a talk about First tonight. It's a great pleasure to welcome Evan Thomas to Roosevelt House. In a way I'm sure he doesn't know, I might not have devoted my writings to Lincoln at all had it not been for Evan Thomas. That is his father. Because in 1952, now this is not my influence moment, I was 3 years old in 1952, but while an editor at Harper, the senior Mr. Thomas published an unlikely book by an unlikely author, a Hungarian refugee, on the Lincoln image that went on to inspire me as a boy and inform my own career. Evan, do you know who I'm talking about? Stephen Laurent. Yeah. He even took Laurent to Norton when he went to Norton. And as long as we're talking about DNA, let's not forget that Evan's grandfather ran against Franklin D. Roosevelt 4 times. And it was not popular.
He only lost by 20 million votes.
It was not popular then to say I'm a socialist, but his father, Norman Thomas, said he was a socialist. In his own amazing career, Evan Thomas served as a correspondent and editor at both Time and Newsweek for more than 30 years, producing an astounding 100 cover articles. He's the author of 10 books, including John Paul Jones, Sea of Thunder, and Being Nixon. And he's taught writing and journalism at both Princeton and his alma mater, Harvard. It's an honor to have you here, Evan. And it's an honor, too, to welcome back my friend Akhil Reed Amar, the Sterling Professor of Law and Political Science at Yale, with which he has been affiliated almost continuously ever since graduating the college summa cum laude 39 years ago, as a child, clearly. Although he did take one break to clerk for Judge Stephen Breyer. A prolific and acclaimed author in his own right, his books include America's Constitution and the Constitution Today, and he has spoken here at Roosevelt House before. So what a treat it is to be gathered at a challenging moment in the age of a divided Supreme Court and public to discuss a glass ceiling shattering figure of history. Please join me in welcoming in a conversation on First, Evan Thomas and Akhil Amar.
Well, it's such an honor to be with you all, and our conversation is really going to revolve quite a lot around the cover of this extraordinary book, which I urge you all to read. It's beautifully written. It's lyrical, and filled with all sorts of things that I myself didn't know about one of the most important judicial figures, really, of my lifetime. So there's a lot here. New York Times best-selling author, first, Sandra Day O'Connor, an intimate portrait of the first woman Supreme Court Justice. Now, we just heard about how in this very building, Frances Perkins is invited to become the first woman cabinet officer, and we're going to talk about firstness soon enough. But I found, actually, perhaps the most compelling part of the book, the more personal story, the intimate portrait. I think after reading the book, I fell in love with, as did other people in her life, Sandra Day O'Connor, maybe more than Justice O'Connor. And so, Evan, I want to invite you to tell her life story. She's a person of extraordinary life force, of energy. Her childhood on a ranch, her time at Stanford, where she meets some very interesting people in the law who will play a role later in her life, her role as a young lawyer, mother, wife, eventually a lawmaker and state judge, then her time as the first justice, woman justice, and off the court when she steps down. So that's the life arc. She's still with us. So tell her story, which is billed, and I think quite fairly, as an intimate portrait. There are moments in this book where you are in her master bathroom medicine cabinet, and you are learning about pharmaceutical choices made by the O'Connors. It quite delivers as an intimate portrait, but take us through the life, please, before we get to Justice O'Connor and this idea of firstness.
It's wonderful to be in this house full of history with two great historians, probably others amongst you. Justice O'Connor, Sandra Day, was born on a ranch that was 160,000 acres. It was down on the southeast corner of Arizona, bleak, desolate, but bleakly beautiful at the same time. And they thought of it as their own country. Their house was 8 miles from the road. There was no running water when she was, no electricity. It was a harsh environment. She's a girl in a man's world. She has to learn how to be self-sufficient. She has a father who loves her but is demanding. And one story she loved to tell was that when she was 15 years old, one of her jobs was to drive lunch out to the roundup, many miles. And so this 15-year-old girl gets in her truck, and of course she has a flat tire. She has to change the tire, jumping on the jack. She gets there, she's late. And she says, "Dad, I had a flat." And he looks at her and says, "You're late." And she said, "Well, I had a flat tire." And he said, "Next time, leave earlier." This was an important lesson and self-reliance and not making excuses. Sandra Day O'Connor's law clerks learned in a real hurry, no excuses. And she imposed those demands on herself as well. Now, her father was loving, but he could be a little tough when he had a drink or two in the evening. But she learned a lot from watching her mother. Her mother was a very elegant woman in this dusty world, always wore a dress, subscribed to Vogue, wanted to be ladylike, and when her husband was harsh with her, as he could be, she learned how to roll with it. And the lesson for Sandra was, don't get into stupid fights. Don't take the bait. You know, they're just things you have to put up with in life. There are times when you got to stand up for yourself, but a lot of times, just walk away from the stupid fight. She learned that watching her mother. So she had these important life lessons and many others. She was so happy as a 16-year-old girl to go to Stanford because it was a whole new world for her. It opened up. She took a course as a freshman called Western Civ. They no longer teach this course at Stanford. It's considered to be too patriarchal and too hegemonic and all that, because it's a celebration of the West. You know, it's a celebration of constitutional government and the rule of law. I've read her final exam in that. It is a brilliant, 17-year-old girl, it is a brilliant piece of work. She understood at a very early age the deep meaning of the rule of law, and she got it from that course. She learned some other things. She was a 16-year-old girl. First night, she goes to a dance. And this is 1946. Girls don't ask boys to dance, but she did. She walks up to the cutest boy there, a 23-year-old Navy veteran named Andy Campbell, and asked him to dance. He fell in love. When Osi and I, my wife and I, who did all my reporting with me, when Osi and I met with Andy Campbell 2 years ago, he was still in love with her. In fact, he would go visit her down in Phoenix, and he would say, "Oh, Sandra, I love you." And she would say, "Oh, Andy, don't we have nice families?" So she did extremely well at Stanford and Stanford Law School in only 6 years. You know, the top of her class, Order of the Coif, maybe they didn't have class rank, but maybe number 3 in her class. Number 1 in her class, clearly, was a fellow named Bill Rehnquist. Now, a couple of things about this. One is that Bill Rehnquist fell in love with her. And he left law school early, in the middle of his 3rd year, to go become a Supreme Court clerk for Justice Jackson. And he was lonely and missed Sandra. And Osi and I, well, just to take a step back, Osi and I were given total access to all of her papers. But we kept asking ourselves, where are the love letters? Because they weren't in her papers. We were over at her chambers in the Supreme Court, and her secretary took us into a closet in the basement, and there was a box marked correspondence. And in that box were some love letters, not only love letters between John and Sandra, but love letters from Bill, 14 love letters to Sandra. And I think in the 6th one in March of 1952, it was the line I read to myself, "Sandy, will you marry me?" He asked her to marry, and the answer was no. She did string him along for a while because she was in love with John, but John wasn't asking her to marry. And she'd been proposed to 4 times. This is 1952. It all worked out. Rehnquist married the woman he loved, ultimately, Nan, and she married the woman she loved. But, of course, they kept this as a secret from everybody, including their own families. When we found these letters, I don't think we would have been allowed to see these letters, to tell you the truth, if the families had known about them. But they didn't. And I think, why didn't Rehnquist and Sandra Day O'Connor reveal this? I thought they thought it would be embarrassing if they got to the court and people knew about this. Harry Blackmun, Justice Blackmun, did know that they dated a little bit, and on the day that Sandra O'Connor came onto the bench, the Supreme Court bench, Blackmun leaned over to Rehnquist and said, "Now, no fooling around." Sandra Day O'Connor married John O'Connor. They go to Phoenix. John O'Connor, who's law review, but not nearly as smart as Sandra, he has no trouble getting a job at the best law firm in Phoenix. Sandra's had nothing but trouble. She applied to 40 law firms in the West Coast. Not a single one would interview her as a lawyer. One law firm gave her an interview to talk to her about being a legal secretary and asked her how well she could type. She finally got a job at the DA's office in Palo Alto, San Mateo DA. She went to the DA and he said, I'm not going to hire you. I don't have any money. And she said, I'll work for free. I don't have any place for you to work. I'll work at the secretary's desk. She finally got hired, and it's so characteristic of her that instead of being bitter and angry about this, she said she was grateful because the fact that she couldn't get a job in the private sector drove her to the public sector, where she spent her life in service, and she was grateful for that. She had a great capacity for gratitude. And she stayed grateful in Phoenix. They had a good life. She had 3 kids. Pretty tough to pull off what she pulled off.
Three boys.
3 boys.
She's always surrounded by men
men.
Childhood on. She's a girl who has to become one of the boys.
And she's comfortable with the boys, even in the state legislature. Now, you try to think what the Arizona state legislature, he runs for office and becomes a state senator. The Arizona state legislature in 1970 was not a female-friendly place, to put it mildly. For one thing, a lot of the members drank heavily. The lobbyists were always handing out booze. And they were tough with her. I talked to a fellow named Alfredo Gutierrez, who was the Democratic leader on the other side. And he knew, and they all knew, that Sandra Day O'Connor had an involuntary shake. When she got stressed out, she would shake a little bit. And Gutierrez would say to his pals on the Democratic side, watch, I'm going to make her twitch. And they would do little things to try to get her goat. And she didn't like it, but, and at least once I know her aides found her crying in the bathroom. But she did not take the bait. She didn't get in their stupid fights. And every once in a while, she would stand up. My favorite story on this is there was a guy named Goodwin, who was a drunk by 10 a.m. drunk, chairman of the House Appropriations Committee. And she called him on his drunkenness, and he looked at her and said, if you were a man, I'd punch you in the nose. And she said, if you were a man, you could. She became a judge.
Just before, there's a firstness in this part of the story,
I forgot. She was the first ever woman majority leader of a state senate, ever, anywhere in the United States. So the men may have given her a hard time, but they respected her enough to vote for her as majority leader, partly because one of their aides said, well, there wasn't much competition if you're doing it on smarts. And she was just smarter than the others. She was also good at parliamentary procedure, which she learned in the junior league. She was president of the junior league before she did this.
And wasn't she good at throwing parties?
And she also was very smart. She had good social skills. She'd give pool parties. And her husband, John, they're very much part of a team. He knew what every legislator liked to drink. They said that she was actually a little chilly, a little standoffish. John was the sociable one and would get everybody liquored up. But she was smart enough to have both parties, a bipartisan party at her pool, both Republicans and Democrats, and she had respect on both sides of the aisle. So along comes 1980, and Ronald Reagan is 10 points behind with women running for president. And one of his aides said, we got to close the gender gap here. And so he promises that if he gets elected president, one of his first appointees to the Supreme Court will be a woman. The fellows at the Justice Department don't believe him. They don't think he's serious about it. They think Ken Starr, who's the chief assistant to the Attorney General, William French Smith, thinks that they're going to be able to appoint Bob Bork, who is a leading conservative light and a true believer. But William French Smith, the Attorney General, comes to them and says, no, the president's serious. It's going to be a woman. Now, the only catch here is that there aren't any women Republican judges in 1980. It's a closed fraternity. Of the 600 federal judges, there are only 8 women, and almost all of them are Democrats. So it's a fairly narrow field, even though she's an intermediate state court judge whose least favorite course in law school was constitutional law. She's it. And she charms Reagan. She was very good at men. She was good at flirting in a non-sexual way. She never made wives feel nervous. She had an easy manner, and she was flirtatious but comfortable and easy. Reagan loved her. Nancy loved her. And so there she is on the Supreme Court, but completely, really, on paper, unprepared.
Now, so now we're up to so we've done a bit of the intimate portrait. You haven't talked about how she's Wonder Woman just a little bit, just all the other things that she does. So, and then we'll talk about first.
She was annoyingly perfect. Among other things, she cooked every recipe in the Julia Child cookbook one year. And one of her friends said, "Oh, Sandra, do you have to do everything perfectly?" She was a good mom. She was a good cook. She was a good dancer. I love this. She and John were such good dancers that people would stop and watch them. And the hotel, the Biltmore Hotel, where Ossie and I are about to go tomorrow, they would stand the O'Connors to drinks just to watch them dance. There was just nothing. She was a great golfer. The first time she ever broke, I don't know if any of you are golfers, but the first time she ever stepped on a golf course, she broke 100. Why? Because she'd been practicing for 4 years on that. This is typical of her preparation. She was a good tennis player. She just was a good skier. She was a bad singer. I'm glad she was bad at something. She was but an enthusiastic singer.
First, one of the leitmotifs of the book is this story, this quite extraordinary woman against the backdrop of women generally between, let's say, the Great Depression and today. So it's a kind of the life and times of Sandra Day O'Connor, with particular emphasis, I think, on the gender angle. So maybe just tell us a little bit about larger historical forces as they apply to gender in this period, and how she's in the middle of all of this.
Well, of course, there is a women's movement by the late 60s, a strong women's movement, and there's something called the Equal Rights Amendment. She, as a state senator, introduces the Equal Rights Amendment in the Arizona legislature, and then a funny thing happens. She lets it die in committee. Well, the sponsors of the ERA were furious with her. They felt betrayed by her, and that she sold them out to political expediency to curry favor with Barry Goldwater, her friend, and neighbor, and senator, for a federal judgeship. There's no question that O'Connor was politically ambitious. But really what drove her was the understanding that the ERA, because with the rise of feminism, of course, there's a counter-movement, as there always is in history. Remember Phyllis Schlafly? Well, there's an anti-feminist movement that comes, and its big cause is opposing ERA. Phyllis Schlafly arrives in Phoenix about the same time that the ERA does, and O'Connor realizes that the bill is going to fail. So she doesn't push it because she knows it's going to lose. Instead, it's not like she drops the issue. Instead, she quietly goes around and she does what she's capable of doing. She changes every law in the state of Arizona that's gender biased. She goes local, and she uses her political power. She can do that. She can't pass the ERA, but she can do this other thing. And nobody's paying any attention really to it, but she gets it all done.
So now say, we're still on the cover here, so we've talked a little bit about this intimate portrait, a little bit about her firstness. We can talk some more about that. But of course, most of the people here know her as Justice O'Connor. This promises to be an account of an intimate portrait of the first woman Supreme Court Justice. So you haven't really told us yet very much about her time on the court, not just her life, because we've got to continue the life story, but her contributions as a member of the Supreme Court. Is she an important justice? If so, why? Would the court have been different without her? Tell us about Justice O'Connor.
She becomes an important justice on two levels, and significantly not a third, but let me do the first two. When she gets to the court, she finds that it's a cold place, physically cold, all that marble. In fact, she goes out in the courtyard and turns her face up to the sun because she misses it. And she goes
It's
to
not Arizona.
and it's not Arizona. Washington is not Arizona. And she goes to her first lunch. The justices have lunch at least once a week. And she goes to her first lunch, and there are only half the court shows up. Only 4 of the other 8 justices. Where is everybody? The justices, although they're appointed for life, they don't necessarily have to like each other. And in 1981, they're suspicious of each other because the book The Brethren has just come out. Bob Woodward's book, expose of the Supreme Court. And they're not sure, these justices are not sure who the leakers are. So they don't trust each other. And so half of them aren't even showing up. She made it her cause to make sure the justices came to lunch. Pretty simple thing, but not that easy. She would show up in their chambers and just sit there until they came to lunch with her. Clarence Thomas, remember Clarence Thomas, had a very difficult confirmation hearing, obviously the Anita Hill thing. Sandra Day O'Connor did not love that at all, obviously. But when Clarence Thomas showed up, he told me, I interviewed him, and he said, I felt hammered. I'd been hammered in my hearings. And I'm walking back alone to my chambers, and Sandra Day O'Connor fell in step with me and said to me, those hearings were very damaging. And Thomas wasn't sure how to respond. He didn't know what to say. I mean, damaging to me, yes, damaging to me personally, damaging to the Supreme Court. So Thomas doesn't say anything. And Justice Thomas doesn't say anything. But the next day, and the day after, and the day after, she continues to walk with him to his chambers and saying, Clarence, you got to come to lunch. Finally, she says, Clarence, you got to come to lunch. He goes, yes, ma'am. And he starts to come to lunch, and he told me that it changed everything for him. He went from being a lonely, alienated fella to somebody who blended into this larger group. It's not like she forgot about who Anita Hill was. She just understood that life has got to go on. This is an institution. It has to function. We have to work together.
And this is a little bit like the pool parties, right?
Yes, it's a lot like the pool parties. And it's,
Bringing
some justices...
people together over a meal.
Right.
And she's
Breaking
quite a
bread.
cook.
And she was a cook. She would cook even for her clerks. Every Saturday, when they did this kind of moot court, she'd make lunch, usually Mexican food. And she saw herself in that, this is blending roles, traditional mother, caretaker, hostess, and most powerful woman in the world, all wrapped, or in the United States, all wrapped into one relatively comfortable package, but not that comfortable at first.
Okay, so you said there are going to be 3 things, and she excels at 2. So that's kind of the social thing.
The social piece. Now, she's uneasy on the court when she first gets there, and she votes mostly with the conservative, with Bill Rehnquist, her old boyfriend Bill. She's with him 85% of the time at the beginning, and she does share some philosophical similarities with him on federalism and this idea that the Warren Court, as you may remember, did not think the states were the best conservators of human values, and put up with a lot of, either through the courts or through the executive branch, of second-guessing the states and animating the Bill of Rights to give power and strength to minorities. She's not against that, but she thought the states had been pushed aside a little bit too much.
So she
joins with
Rehnquist, who has moved to Arizona, and Ronald Reagan, and Nancy, and another cowgirl, are part of a kind of a Western sagebrush, not quite deep Southern, but a Western sagebrush federalism pushback against imperial Washington.
Sandra's father was against daylight savings. He thought that was a federal intrusion. Sandra's not there. In fact, Sandra's father was mad at how his daughter had turned into a Keynesian in college. But she does have, just as Akil said, she definitely has a big streak of that. Now, as time goes on, like a lot of justices, she moves to the left. Not like Harry Blackmun, not that far, but she does move. You can see it in her votes. She is sensitive to the rights of women. She is sensitive to children's issues, and she's very much a compromiser. Her big achievement on the court is to get courts, to get 5 votes. She's not quite Brennan, who was a master politician at this, and sometimes she'll be on her own. But the statistics don't lie. In 25 years, she is the 5th decisive vote in 330 cases. That gave her a lot of power, and significantly in 2 areas, in affirmative action and in abortion rights. It was expected. Harry Blackmun thought that when she came on the court as a Reagan appointee, she would be one of these Reagan appointees to vote against Roe v. Wade. And initially, she was against his reasoning in Roe v. Wade. But she becomes the savior of Roe, or at least the idea that women do have a constitutional right to an abortion. Her analysis is different. She goes about it a different way. She basically does away with Harry Blackmun's trimester system. We can get into the details on that later. But she acts in a compromised way to preserve abortion rights. Same thing with affirmative action. She's not over on the left a big fan of it. And in fact, part of her really doesn't like affirmative action very much. But she is the one who, in the end, saves it. At least in higher education, in the Grutter case in 2002, she is the decisive vote and writes the opinion. And the reason why affirmative action is still on the books as the law of the land today is Sandra Day O'Connor. That's real power.
So you have abortion rights, and well, there's one other one that you maybe haven't mentioned. How about church-state?
This is also important.
So
just the
abortion, affirmative action, and now how about church-state?
The background on this is that you remember the Warren Court wants to get basically religion out of the classroom, school prayer case, and separate religion from governance and society. Republicans want to let some religion back in. And these are convoluted cases, but the Chief Justice in particular wants a standard that will allow some religious displays. And he thinks that Sandra's going to go along with him. He would take her in she would talk about this. He would have me in for tea, she would say. Clearly not enjoying this process. She went her own way. She had her own standard, which was very much based on the idea that the state should never be in the position of making people feel like outsiders. That if there's a cross and the state has put it out there, if it makes people feel like they're outsiders, that doesn't go. And so she refused to go along with this emerging Republican or conservative ideological consensus of religion back in. She had her own way of doing it. She wasn't all the way over to the left of keeping religion out altogether, but she carved her own path, and she became, again, the decisive vote on many of these cases.
Now, you're not very heavy-handed about it, but in conversations you suggested to me that there is a kind of a feminist angle in some of this. She herself is a bit of a gender outsider, more than a bit, in all these milieux, from the ranch to Stanford to her own family life to the Arizona legislature to the court. In affirmative action, she comes to see that just as women might offer a different perspective in some ways than men, that might be true for underrepresented racial groups. So you might think there's a feminist angle there. On abortion, of course, she reorients the case away from a doctor's right to perform abortion, which Harry Blackmun tended to see. He worked at the Mayo Clinic, to a perspective about women's equality and control over their lives and destiny, and maybe only someone who had been pregnant multiple times could have really seen that in a personal way on the court that time. Tell us about at least one other area where the women's issue is front and center. Her first term on the court, you think there's a very interesting case that they may not know so much about, the Hogan case.
Yeah. In her very first term, she's confronted with a case of a man who wants to become a nurse in Mississippi. Well, the only way you can do that in Mississippi is go to the Mississippi College for Women, University for Women. They don't take them. Now, this is, how many of you have seen the Ruth Bader Ginsburg movie? Well, here we go. You remember the famous case in there is where they have the brilliant insight that it's going to help gender rights if we take up the cause of men being excluded. This is the same thing that's happening in the Hogan case. And although Ruth Bader Ginsburg has done a lot of work as an advocate for the ACLU in this area in the 70s, she now is a Court of Appeals judge. It's O'Connor who's on the Supreme Court. And O'Connor takes the majority opinion in the Hogan case and pushes the ball forward. The goal here for the activists is that women should be treated like minority groups, like African Americans, under the Equal Protection Clause. That's what they're inching towards. They don't quite get there. There's intermediate scrutiny, but that's the general progress in a slow-moving, incremental way. And O'Connor was very much of an incrementalist. She makes this move, and interestingly, and carries the court. Interestingly, Ruth Bader Ginsburg's husband, who you also remember from seeing that, Marty comes home the night that the Hogan case comes down with Sandra Day O'Connor's majority opinion, and he reads it, and he looks at his wife, and he says to Ruth, "Did you write this?" So O'Connor and now, again, Ruth Bader Ginsburg is more of an overt activist, but they are working the same side of the street.
She didn't love the term swing justice, and I'm not sure it actually described her as well as, say, Anthony Kennedy, who was all in, sometimes for liberal things, same-sex marriage with the liberals, all in for certain conservative ideas, Citizens United. Kennedy genuinely swung, another Reagan appointee from the West. I would say that O'Connor didn't swing so much as split the difference. There's a difference between all in on one side in some issues, all in on the other, and so yes, a right to abortion, but we're going to cut back on the trimester system that Harry Blackmun put forth. Government can, I'm going to find a middle path and affirmative action. It's not completely colorblind on the one hand, but quotas are not permissible on the other hand, plus factors. That's a splitting of the difference and not quite a swinging.
Her clerks called it baby bearing. Not too hot, not too cold, just right. And that describes her jurisprudence.
Not absolute, strict separation of church and state, but also not government. Anything goes, and government can proclaim this to be a Christian nation or Utah to be a Mormon state or something like that, because that would create a feeling of outsiderness. So again, a splitting of sorts. Okay. Now, so those are some of the big areas where you think she's got a distinctive jurisprudence and is the most powerful woman in America, if not the world, maybe alongside Margaret Thatcher or something like that, Indira Gandhi, who isn't mentioned because you're too into Western civ, but we,
Sorry.
No, but we'll just let that one go. But now the elephant in the room. Did she ever, any mistakes, big mistakes that she made, and you know what I'm talking about. So we
all
talk
do.
about
Bush
it.
v. Gore, 5-4 vote. Once again, she has this. Akil is right. She didn't like the word swing. She thought that implied fickleness. So she liked to be the decisive vote, not the swing vote. But yes, Bush v. Gore. You must all recall. The Florida voting is a mess, as she would say, hanging chads and all that. And, of course, it gets to the courts. And I won't get into the procedural history, but the Florida Supreme Court, by a 4-3 vote, decides that the recount of the votes should continue. And this goes to the Supreme Court, and all 5 conservatives, Republicans, on the Supreme Court say no. They stay the recount, effectively meaning that George Bush is going to be president. The 4 liberals are apoplectic and write some pretty strong dissents about all this. So how do we explain this? How did Justice O'Connor feel about it? I'm going to get into the weeds a little bit here, but bear with me. O'Connor was very troubled by this case, as they all were. But the thing that worried her the most was she was a small p political person who was looking down the road. What happened if the recount continued? What would happen? Well, it would go on maybe into December and January, and it was possible that you would end up with two sets of electors because the Republican Secretary of State, Catherine Harris, had already certified one set of electors. If Gore won, there'd be a second set of electors. So what happens? The law provides for what happens under the three
The
U.S.
Electoral
Code
Count
15.
Act of 1877.
Right.
Yeah.
So what happens? If there are two sets of electors, the House and the Senate have an equal vote. The House, which was going to be Republican, was going to vote for Bush. The Senate, which was going to be Democratic, was going to vote for Gore. So how are they going to break that tie? Under the law, the tie is broken by the governor of the state, whose name was Bush, right? So she's looking down the road at what she thinks is a car crash and really messy outcome. Now, Akil's about to argue that that may be messy, but that's what the Constitution and the law provides, so why didn't they go with that? And that's a very, obviously, a defensible legal view. Her view, because she's a pragmatist, was she was going to do the practical thing and, in a way, take one for the team. Produce a dog's breakfast of an opinion, and it was a horribly written opinion, which she mostly wrote.
How did Scalia describe it?
Scalia, wasn't
in New York prose?
He described the reasoning, the use of the Equal Protection Clause as we say in Brooklyn, a piece of shit. And other people, a little less luridly, had the same opinion, including other dissenters, and most of the press, and Akil and most academics agreed. It's a one-time only. O'Connor wrote a sentence in there. This is a one-time only opinion, no precedent, no precedential value. So as a legal opinion, it is an abomination. As a practical solution to a terrible problem facing democracy, I would argue that it was a defensible solution. Now, she herself had some regrets about it. She's somebody who doesn't regret anything. She's a no-regrets person. Do it and move on. But on this one thing...
The Edith Piaf of the Supreme Court.
On this one thing, she did have some regrets. She would get short with people sometimes and say, you know, get over it when she was in a bad mood about it. Other times, but privately she expressed some regrets. And even with me, I asked her about it. And she said, yeah, you can have regrets in life, but and maybe I had a few, but you have to move on. She did tell the Chicago Tribune editorial board about 4 years after the decision that maybe we should not have taken the case. The Supreme Court should have let it go on. That's a pretty strong statement for her, actually. And I know that she took she did not like, she's an institutionalist, and she didn't like it that the court really took a hit on this, and that she personally took a hit. In fact, she told her son, on the morning the decision came down, she told her son, as she was eating an English muffin, half the country is going to hate me by the end of the day. And she was right, and they did.
And I was very critical, and I, at the time, a mutual friend of ours, Jeff Rosen, who's quoted in here, I think the one-word title of his piece in New Republic is disgrace, and it was a shonda. It was just, you know, and I've always thought so, and I haven't changed my mind in the slightest.
I didn't persuade Akil. In fact, I don't think I even came close.
But, and I always really I felt that personally affronted because she just said, get over it, which is the same thing Scalia did. But after reading the book, I have to tell you, I've softened on this a bit because you've given me insight into her as a person, and for her just to survive all of the things that life had thrown at her, from this very bleak, desolate upbringing with a whole bunch of boys on an Arizona ranch. Yes, she had to actually just always go forward, not look back. That's how she got through life, and so that's actually a very deep part of her inner constitution, so to speak. So I came to have a little bit more understanding of that. Now, here's where I would say she actually failed on her own terms. Yep. And then we're going to get your questions in 5 minutes, but I'm going to invite you to close after I offer a different thing that she should have done, truer to her best self, even if you're going to be political about the thing, I want you to complete the life story, because we haven't quite gotten to the end of the book, and there's some genuinely poignant things that you haven't shared with the audience. So taking one for the team is not 5 justices, it's 9. So if you're going to make stuff up, go in it together. Go in, say, Clarence, you have to come to lunch. We all have to come to lunch. We all have to hold hands together and jump off this cliff together. We have to figure out something that all of us can live with, okay? And maybe none of us love it, but we can't be 5-4 in a partisan way about this if we're going to be making stuff up, doing stuff that actually isn't precedented and isn't actually in the text of the Constitution, and that we say we're never going to do again. So, and that was a fan, because that was part of her too, this idea that we all have to work together, and Bush versus Gore was actually a train wreck as a matter of genuine teamwork and taking it for the team.
The Supreme Court did this in about 2 days, and nobody should do anything this important in 2 days.
Yes.
Now, there's an interesting question. Could they have let the clock continue to run? I think they felt a time pressure on this now.
Yeah.
Maybe that was a false impression.
They should have taken a few more days. Get it right.
Well, and there's, I mean, it's true in Brown v. Board of Education, Earl Warren got all 9.
Yes.
Even Warren Burger in the United States against Nixon got all 9.
Absolutely, and those are sort of, I think, genuinely useful precedents. But tell us, and then we're going to get your questions about the rest of this extraordinary arc of her life story.
Well, by the early 2000s, the pundits are calling it the O'Connor Court, because in so many ways it is. But there's a big problem. Her husband, her beloved husband, with whom she had a great marriage, has Alzheimer's. And his symptoms start showing up in about 1995, and by 2001, 2002, I have his diary for all 20 years, and it just peters out. It's so sad. The sentences get shorter and shorter, and the thinking gets simpler and simpler, and it just stops in 2002. And she would bring him to her chamber. She wanted to personally take care of him. And she would bring him to her chambers, where he would sleep on the bench in the front office. But by 2005, she decides she's got to go. And she said, John sacrificed for me. When we moved to Washington, he gave up his big job as the big man in the law firm in Phoenix to come to Washington. Now I am going to sacrifice for him. And so even though she was riding high as a justice, she retired. But of course, life is tragic, and within 6 months of her leaving the court, her husband can barely recognize her, and she has to put him into a home. And it gets even more gothic than that, because as many of you must know, in Alzheimer's, Alzheimer's patients can form what they call mistaken attachments. And in this case, John O'Connor found another woman who was his friend, and Sandra Day O'Connor would come in there, and one time John O'Connor introduced Sandra to his wife, turning to the other woman. Another time, Sandra just came in, and John's holding the woman's hand. Sandra comes in and sits down and holds his other hand. Now, publicly, she said, this is wonderful, John. John had been depressed, and now he's happy. But privately, it broke her heart. Of course it did.
Okay, that's the life story. Maybe one transitional question, and then we're going to bring the mic in. You haven't quite brought yourself into the story quite much. Tell us about how you and OC got permission to write this. How did this all come about? Because this is you found all sorts of stuff that no one else did, because you had access that no one else did. How did that happen?
Well, there was some talk. She had been a Random House author with A Lazy Bee, a wonderful book about growing up on a ranch. And so Kate Medina at Random House was after her for years to do her memoir, and she thought about it. But she's a very discreet person, so I'm not sure she ever was going to pull the trigger. She hemmed and hawed on this. Finally, she decided that she did want a biography. She wanted to be remembered. She cared about her legacy. She really wanted a biography. And so they brought me in. I was the Random House author with a law degree who came in. She was starting to show some early signs, but she was still pretty vigorous.
Signs of what?
Of dementia.
Oh, so she, see, they don't know
I'm
all
sorry.
of that. Yeah.
She and I'm sorry, I'm assuming knowledge. It's a mistake. She herself has dementia. She has Alzheimer's. Well, she has dementia, probably Alzheimer's. When you get it late in life, it's not that clear a diagnosis. When I met her, she was still pretty amazing. The night I met her, when I went to Phoenix, she worked a room of 150 people and gave a toast to Justice Souter, who was down there, and she addressed Justice Souter as Toots. Hiya, Toots. So she was still vigorous and alive, but the shadows were starting to creep in, and now she has full-blown Alzheimer's 3 years later. But she wanted to have a biography written of herself, and so she wrote a letter to her clerks and to her colleagues asking them to talk to us, and opened up her papers.
And now I think at this point we go to questions. And maybe if you would just wait for the microphone, please, so we can all hear you.
Was there something about her retirement from the court that was influenced by a conversation or more with Rehnquist?
She and Rehnquist had an interesting conversation because Chief Justice Rehnquist had cancer, throat cancer, and he was sick, and so he was thinking of leaving the court, and she was thinking of leaving the court, and they talked, but they didn't both want to go because they knew it was going to be too complicated to appoint two justices at once, bad for the institution. So they knew only one of them could go. Finally, at a bridge game in June of 2005, Rehnquist says, well, I'm going to stay. I'm going to stay at least another year. And as she left the bridge game, she said to her friend Cynthia Helms, okay, I'm going to go. And she went to her office, she went to her chambers, and she wrote a letter of resignation right then. She was relieved in a way because she really did want to go to take care of John. Now, as it happened, Chief Justice Rehnquist died a month or two later. Died September 1st, so this is July, so 2 months later. She had a slight moment of wondering if Justice Rehnquist had been totally open with her about his illness. I think that's kind of fuzzy. And there are conspiracy theories about this, but I think I steer people away from them because she did want to leave. She wasn't tricked into this. She wanted to leave the court. She wanted to take care of John. How forthcoming Rehnquist was, I don't know. And also, Rehnquist wanted to live, don't we all? So he may have been misleading himself. In any case, he died on about September 1st, 3rd, something like that. And this was a problem for poor Sandra because she pledged to President Bush she would stay on the court until a replacement was chosen. Well, first it was going to be Roberts was going to replace her.
John Roberts.
But then Rehnquist dies. They elevate Roberts to be Chief Justice. Now they still have an opening. They appoint or nominate Harriet Miers, the White House counsel. That did not go well. And so then Alito comes in, and so it's January. So she's lost 6 months that she could have been with John as a lame duck waiting finally for her seat to be filled.
I think we have a question over here.
Hi. The one thing that hasn't come out is her humor. She was. I remember one time she took us through the Supreme Court after she'd retired, and she was very funny. But she also moved, using that humor and her persona, she moved through all of the fine social circles of Washington, D.C. And I think with Cynthia Helms and a bunch of other people, it would be interesting to hear, did that all come into what you
Sure.
are writing?
Oh, yeah. No, I spent a lot of time talking to her buddies. She was the most socially active Supreme Court justice in history, by far. For one thing, not just in Washington society, she was in like 4 different, not just the Waltz group, the sort of coolest, preppiest one, but 3 others. She traveled all over the world. Now, interestingly, she did this partly for John. You have to think about this for a second. John's gone from being the big man in Phoenix. Now he's in Washington, and he's not. But at night, he can be. He can be the social lion. So when they went out, although she was funny and garrulous, she would shut up. And she would say, oh, John, tell us a story. To hear the same story that he told 8 million times. But he was a great storyteller. She wanted to let him be the lion at night for his own ego, really. And she told me, she said, I would have been home reading briefs. She had to read 1,000 pages a day as a Supreme Court justice. She was a speed reader, amazing retention. But she's going out a lot, really. Yes, she liked to dance. Yes, she liked to go out. But a lot of this is for John.
Next question, and while we're waiting for the microphone to come over, since you're talking about social, what's her social and professional relationship to the other woman on the court when she's there, and eventually two other women who joined the court after her departure?
Justice O'Connor welcomed Justice Ginsburg in 1993. It had been 12 long years, and one of the first things that happened was they actually built a ladies' room outside the court conference room. It had been 12 years of her having to go down the hall and borrow a bathroom. But much more than that, she was glad to have an ally and somebody that would work with her and did work with her. However, she was never an intimate pal of Ginsburg. They were different people. And Justice Ginsburg told O.C. and me when we went to see her that not once did Justice O'Connor come to her chambers to talk about a case. Not once in all those years together. There is a funny story that shows how different they were. Justice O'Connor was driving a car by the time she was 10 years old. A tractor, and a truck and everything else. Justice Ginsburg, city girl, didn't learn how to drive till she came to Washington when she was in her late 30s, and she was a terrible driver.
Because no one in the boroughs needs a car, right? It's a hassle.
Now, the problem with this was that the Supreme Court justices have a parking garage, and Justice Ginsburg, I was first told this by Justice O'Connor's messenger, Romeo Cruz, rear-ended Justice O'Connor's car, not once but twice. So O.C. and I weren't quite sure how to deal with this, and so we at the end of the interview, we said, Justice Ginsburg, is it true that you ran into Justice O'Connor's car? And Justice Ginsburg said, oh, it's true. She said, I've never driven again. And she said, I was so worried about hitting Justice Scalia's car. And supposedly Justice O'Connor actually bribed or paid the attendants to park Justice Ginsburg's cars.
Very pragmatic.
Pragmatic.
If she had not resigned when she did to take care of her husband, what's your best guesstimate as to when she would have resigned because of her dementia?
Well, she resigned at the age of 75. Her first symptoms start showing up, this is a little blurry, but I would say late 2012. So that is 7 years later. She would have been 82. I'm guessing then. She dreaded Alzheimer's because her mom and her aunt, and of course her experience with John, but she knew it was in her family. So she feared that above all things. And when it came for her, she was in denial about it for a while. Her kids had to kind of convince her, but she ultimately faced the reality, but grudgingly.
And remember, if she stays, there's the risk that she's going to be replaced by a justice picked by a Democratic president.
Well, this is true, of course, and she was sensitive to that.
She politically times her resignation in certain ways.
That's true. She didn't want to be replaced by a Democrat. In fact, they first talked about retiring, interestingly, in 1996. At 15 years, a Supreme Court justice can retire, full benefits, go senior. And she and John talked about retiring then so they could have a full life together off the court. In 1996, she would have been 66. So there was still plenty of time to play. But they didn't do it, partly because Bill Clinton was president, and they didn't want to have a Democrat appoint her successor. Also, she was getting more powerful and liking her job. These motives are never black and white and crystal clear. But so they started talking about it, but didn't do it. By the mid-2000s, she's got a lot of power. I think she would have wanted to stay for a while longer. I know when John got really sick, she really regretted having left the court. She said so. She said it was the dumbest thing I ever did. She could be quite blunt in her own way, and so it was a heartache for her.
2 more questions. How about up here, please? And while the mic is coming, maybe just tell us a little bit about what her view of her successor turns out to be, and the direction the court takes once she has left.
She was normally a very discreet person, but not about Justice Alito. She was pretty public, saying that she didn't like him personally. She didn't feel a rapport with him. And he is a doctrinaire, rule-bound conservative, Scalia-like conservative. That's not her style at all, not her jurisprudence. In fact, I'm not even sure I would use the word jurisprudence to describe Justice O'Connor. Her kind of state of mind was not like Alito's. And she feared that affirmative action would go away. She feared that abortion rights would go away. She was very worried about money in politics, and she was very upset about Citizens United, and she would have voted the other way on that. So she complained uncharacteristically that her legacy was being undermined.
I understand she's a product of different time and different era and different generation. Now, in a law school setup, we have 50% of the students are women. So I'm not questioning her relevance, but how big a model she could be, both philosophically, politically, as well as legally, to this new generation of women.
She's a model of how to live your life with grace and dignity. She would tell her clerks said, you know, she wasn't just a boss to us, she was a role model. She taught us, you know, obviously work worth doing was her motto. She believed in work. But she also said, have dinner parties. Get culture. She would take her clerks to museums all the time on outings. One of them said, you know, it wasn't like we were stopping to smell the roses. It was more like we were rushing to learn how to be a better rose smeller. But still, she wanted her clerks to be cultured. She wanted them to have families. She would say, put family first. Her clerks would kind of wonder, well, how do you do that exactly if you're a Supreme Court justice? But she believed it, and of course, ultimately she did. She resigned from the court. So she was as a human model of a way to live your life, of things like be firm but don't get into stupid fights. She modeled all sorts of behaviors for her clerks. Half of her clerks were women. You know, that was not normal at all in the Supreme Court. There were some women clerks when she came on, but she normalized that. Long before half of the law schools were female, half of her clerks were female. And so she saw herself as a bridge from an older generation where women had really no power to a world in which women had plenty of power. She didn't necessarily belong in that later world. She was a bridge from one to the other.
Okay, last question, please. Please.
What did she feel was her proudest accomplishment in life as she looked back over her life?
That's a good question. I'm tempted to say, I know what she said. This is interesting, because her friends were a little baffled by it. iCivics. Do you know what iCivics is? iCivics is a computer games for grade schoolers to teach them civics. She started a foundation called iCivics. It now reaches 5 million middle schoolers every year. And she said, my proudest achievement was not the Supreme Court, but iCivics, because iCivics reaches so many kids, and kids don't know anything about civics. You know, she liked to say that the kids have an easier time naming the Three Stooges in the three branches of government.
Which is not exactly fair, because there are 5 stooges. In fact, if you Larry, Curly, Joe, Shemp,
Okay,
Joe.
sorry.
So
I need some fact checking on that, but she
never
did
seemed
say
to be
that.
fair.
She did say that, but it's significant because it showed what importance she put in civics and in civil life. Her religion, her true religion, was civility. She was a broadly speaking Christian. She was out there in that ranch. She would look at the stars, and she read verses at the Bethlehem Chapel. But her real religion was a faith in civic life.
Thank you very much.